In fellowship halls across the South during the 1980s, energy wasn't something people chased. It was built into Sunday plates. Those dishes carried families through entire weeks, and nobody needed science to tell them why. Fried chicken showed up on Sunday tables like clockwork, prepared Saturday night or early morning before church let out. The seasoning soaked in overnight, the cast iron held its heat steady, and the result was something that could anchor a meal for hours. People did not talk about protein or sustenance in clinical terms. They simply knew that this chicken eaten after 2 hours of worship and fellowship would hold them until evening without the hollow crash that comes from lighter foods. It was made in bulk because there was always someone stopping by after service, always another mouth that needed feeding. The ritual of frying it was as much about discipline as flavor, about knowing that certain foods required patience and could not be rushed, and that was only one part of what filled those tables. Macaroni and cheese, the baked church version, was never the stovetop kind. It came out of the oven with edges that had crisped golden brown, the kind of texture that only happened when cheese and butter melted into layers of elbow noodles and then set under steady heat. This was not a side dish in the casual sense. It was central, something people expected and would notice if it went missing. The richness came from real cheddar, sometimes mixed with a softer cheese that made it creamy without being loose. After hours of standing, singing, and moving through a long service, this dish provided the kind of fullness that let people settle into the afternoon without feeling weighed down. It showed up at every potluck, every homecoming, every gathering where the community came together, and there was always something green waiting beside it. Collard greens with smoked meat simmered for hours, sometimes from the night before, until the leaves softened and the broth thickened with flavor drawn out of ham hocks or turkey necks. The pot liquor at the bottom was never wasted. Some people soaked cornbread in it, others drank it straight from a cup. What made this dish sustaining was not just the greens themselves, but everything that cooked down into them. The fat, the salt, the slow transformation of tough leaves into something tender. It appeared on tables when people needed grounding, when the week ahead required endurance. No one called it detoxifying or mineral rich, but women who worked long shifts and men who labored outdoors ate it regularly and felt the difference. It was preparation, not decoration, but the table was far from finished. Black-eyed peas carried a quiet reputation, especially around New Year's, but in church kitchens, they showed up year-round, cooked with onions, a piece of salt pork, and sometimes a pinch of sugar to balance the earthiness. They became soft without falling apart. The consistency mattered. Thick enough to cling to a spoon, loose enough to spread across rice or cornbread. People ate them after services that ran long, after revivals that stretched into the evening, and the peas did what they were supposed to. They filled without overwhelming. They stayed with you without sitting heavy. There was a practicality to them, an understanding that certain foods could be stretched to feed more people without losing their integrity, and they were always paired with something sweeter. Candied yams came to the table gleaming, coated in a syrup made from brown sugar, butter, and sometimes a touch of cinnamon or nutmeg. The yams themselves were sliced thick, baked until they softened but still held their shape, their natural sweetness amplified but not erased. This was not dessert, though it tasted like it could be. It sat alongside the greens and the chicken, a reminder that meals did not have to choose between comfort and function. The sugars released slowly, the density of the yams ensuring that the energy they provided did not spike and vanish. People who spent their afternoons visiting the sick, organizing fellowship events, or simply tending to family found that dishes like this kept them steady. It was understood without being discussed. And then there was the bread. Cornbread, baked in cast iron, came out with a crust that crackled when you broke into it. The inside stayed moist, slightly crumbly, with a flavor that leaned more savory than sweet depending on who made it. Some families added a little sugar, others did not, but everyone agreed it had to be made in a skillet that had been seasoned over years. This bread soaked up pot liquor, balanced out spice, and could be eaten on its own if nothing else was available. It showed up at every meal that mattered, and its presence meant someone had taken the time to do things correctly. The process was simple, but it required attention. The oven had to be hot, the skillet had to be ready, and the batter could not sit too long before baking. That discipline carried into how people approached the rest of their lives. And after the meal, there was always something sweet waiting. Sweet potato pie closed out many Sunday dinners, though calling it dessert felt incomplete. The filling was dense, spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg, sometimes a hint of vanilla, and it sat in a crust that had been rolled thin and baked until it turned golden. This was not the kind of pie that disappeared quickly. One slice was enough, and people ate it slowly, letting the flavor settle. The sweetness came from the potatoes themselves as much as from any added sugar, and the texture was smooth without being airy. It appeared on tables when there was something to celebrate, but also when there was simply a need to gather. The act of making it, peeling, boiling, mashing, seasoning, was part of how women passed down knowledge, how daughters learned patience, and it was never the only dessert. Peach cobbler arrived in rectangular pans, the fruit bubbling up through a lattice of dough that turned crisp on top and soft underneath. The peaches were sometimes fresh, sometimes canned, depending on the season, but either way, they were sweetened just enough to bring out their natural flavor. The cobbler was served warm, often with a scoop of vanilla ice cream melting into the crevices, and it had a way of making people linger at the table. It was not hurried food. It required time to bake properly, and it rewarded those who waited. After a long Sunday, after hours of fellowship and conversation, this dish offered a kind of closure, a signal that the meal was complete. But there was usually one more option. Banana pudding sat in clear glass dishes so you could see the layers. Vanilla wafers softened by custard, sliced bananas turning slightly golden at the edges, whipped cream or meringue piled on top. It was made the night before, so everything had time to meld together, the wafers soaking up the pudding until they became part of the same texture. This dessert showed up at gatherings where children were present, where the mood was celebratory but not formal. It did not require silverware beyond a spoon, and it could be served in individual cups or scooped from a large bowl. The sweetness was gentle, the flavors familiar, and people ate it without thinking too hard about why it made them feel at ease. And then the table turned back toward the practical. Deviled eggs were arranged on plates that had been used for decades, each egg half filled with a yolk mixture seasoned with mustard, mayonnaise, and a sprinkle of paprika. They were made in batches of 2 or 3 dozen because they never lasted long, and they served a specific purpose. They were something people could eat while standing, while talking, while moving between rooms. The preparation required care. The eggs had to be boiled just right so the yolks did not turn gray, and the filling had to be smooth without being runny. They appeared at every potluck, every after-church gathering, every event where people needed something that felt substantial without being heavy, and they always disappeared first. But the heartier dishes were still coming. Chicken and dumplings filled large pots, the chicken falling off the bone after hours of simmering. The dumplings rolled flat and dropped into the broth until they puffed up and absorbed the flavor. This was cold weather food, though it showed up whenever someone needed comfort. The broth was thick, rich with fat and herbs, and the dumplings themselves had a chew to them that made each bite feel intentional. People ate this after funerals, after long meetings, after days when the work did not stop. It was the kind of meal that allowed you to sit down and feel held by something larger than yourself. No one called it healing, but that is what it did, and it was often paired with something just as grounding. Beef pot roast cooked low and slow, surrounded by carrots, potatoes, and onions that softened into the juices released by the meat. The roast itself became tender enough to pull apart with a fork, and the vegetables soaked up enough flavor to stand on their own. This was Sunday dinner in its most complete form, a single pot that fed a crowd, that required little attention once it started cooking, that filled the house with a smell people recognized from rooms away. It was made when there was time, when the day allowed for something that could not be rushed, and the energy it provided was not immediate but enduring, the kind that carried people through Monday and into the rest of the week, and there was always rice to go with it. Rice and gravy appeared so often it became invisible, the foundation beneath other dishes rather than a dish itself. But the gravy mattered. Made from pan drippings, thickened with flour, seasoned with salt and pepper, and whatever herbs were on hand. It turned plain white rice into something people looked forward to, something that stretched a meal further without diminishing it. This combination showed up after church, after choir practice, after any gathering where people needed to eat quickly but well. It was not glamorous, but it was reliable, and reliability meant everything when you were feeding a family on a budget that did not bend. And beside it, there was always bread. Buttermilk biscuits came out of the oven tall and flaky, the tops brushed with butter so they glistened. They were made by hand, the dough folded and pressed until it developed layers, then cut into rounds and baked until they rose. These biscuits were not an afterthought. They were central, used to soak up gravy, to sandwich a piece of ham, to eat with butter and jam when nothing else was left. The process of making them was something people did without recipes, measuring by feel and adjusting based on how the dough responded. It was knowledge passed down through observation, through standing beside someone who had done it 1,000 times before, and they paired with almost everything, including what came next. Fried catfish showed up on Friday nights and after services that ended near dinner time. The fillets coated in seasoned cornmeal and fried until the outside crackled. The fish itself stayed moist, flaky, mild enough to let the coating carry the flavor. This was food that brought people together around a shared table that required enough oil and heat to make it worth doing in quantity. It was often served with hot sauce, with lemon wedges, with coleslaw that cut through the richness. People who worked physical jobs ate this regularly, understanding that it provided the kind of fuel that lasted. It was not light, but it was not supposed to be, and the vegetables kept coming. Cabbage with sausage simmered until the cabbage softened and took on the flavor of smoked sausage sliced into rounds. The dish was simple: cabbage, sausage, onions, maybe a little vinegar to brighten it, but it was filling in a way that lasted. It showed up at potlucks, at weeknight dinners, at any meal where people needed something that could be made in one pot and stretched to feed however many showed up. The cabbage itself was never mushy, cooked just enough to lose its raw edge but still hold some structure, and it was always served with something starchy to balance it out. But there were other beans waiting. Lima beans, cooked with butter and sometimes a piece of ham, became creamy without falling apart. They had a reputation for being bland, but that depended entirely on who made them. When done right, they were seasoned well, cooked until tender, and served as part of a larger plate that needed something mild to balance the bolder flavors. People ate them regularly, not because they were exciting, but because they were dependable, because they provided steady energy without demanding attention. They appeared on tables throughout the year, adapted to whatever else was being served, and no one questioned their place. And they were not the only beans. Pinto beans cooked down with onions and salt pork until the liquid thickened into something close to gravy. They were eaten over rice, with cornbread, or straight from the bowl, and they had a way of making people feel full without feeling sluggish. The beans themselves were soft but intact, and the broth carried enough flavor to make every spoonful worth it. This was everyday food, the kind that showed up on weeknight tables and in packed lunches, the kind that required almost no money but delivered exactly what was needed. People who ate them regularly understood that not every meal had to be complicated to be effective. And then there was okra. Okra, fried or stewed, divided people but showed up regardless. Fried, it was coated in cornmeal and crisped until the slime disappeared entirely, leaving behind something crunchy and addictive. Stewed, it was cooked with tomatoes and onions until it thickened into a dish that clung to rice or bread. Either way, it required someone who knew what they were doing, who understood timing and temperature. It appeared at summer gatherings, at tables where the vegetables came straight from gardens, and it was eaten by people who had grown up with it and knew not to expect it to taste like anything else. And it often sat beside something more complex. Jambalaya filled large pots, a one-dish meal built from rice, sausage, chicken, shrimp, and whatever vegetables were on hand. The rice absorbed the flavors of everything else, turning golden from the spices and the fat, and every spoonful carried a different combination of ingredients. This was celebration food, but also practical food, the kind that could feed a crowd without requiring multiple pots or complicated timing. It showed up at church fundraisers, at family reunions, at any gathering where people needed to eat well without a lot of fuss. The energy it provided came from the density, from the way it filled you completely and kept you satisfied for hours. And it had a close relative. Gumbo started with a roux cooked until it turned the color of chocolate, then built from there with onions, bell peppers, celery, and whatever protein was available. Chicken, sausage, seafood, or all three. The result was a thick stew served over rice, complex in flavor and rich enough to be a complete meal on its own. This was food that required time and attention, that could not be rushed or approximated, and people who made it well were known for it. It appeared at gatherings that mattered, at moments when the meal itself was part of the event, and it was eaten slowly, with respect for the work that went into it, and sometimes there was something simpler. Chicken spaghetti combined pasta with shredded chicken, tomatoes, cheese, and a creamy sauce that held everything together. It was baked until the top turned golden, and it was served in squares that held their shape on the plate. This was potluck food, the kind of dish that traveled well and reheated without losing its integrity. It appeared at fellowship halls, at after-church gatherings, at any event where people needed something filling that could be made in advance. The pasta provided the foundation, the chicken added substance, and the cheese made it comforting without without being too rich, and it was always followed by something just as reliable. Meatloaf, church style, was made with ground beef, breadcrumbs, eggs, and seasonings, then topped with a ketchup-based glaze that caramelized in the oven. It came out in thick slices, dense and savory, and it was served alongside mashed potatoes or green beans. This was weeknight food as much as Sunday food, something that could be made in large quantities and stretched across multiple meals. The leftovers made sandwiches, the drippings made gravy, and nothing went to waste. People ate it regularly because it was dependable, because it required ingredients that were always available, and because it delivered exactly what it promised. And the casseroles kept coming. Hash brown casserole combined shredded potatoes with cheese, sour cream, and butter, then baked until the top crisped and the inside stayed creamy. This was breakfast food that often showed up at dinner, a dish that felt indulgent but was built from simple ingredients. It appeared at holiday tables, at potlucks, at any meal where comfort mattered more than complexity. The potatoes provided the substance. The cheese made it rich, and the texture kept people coming back for more. It was never light, but it was never supposed to be. And it usually sat beside something green. Green bean casserole layered canned green beans with cream of mushroom soup and topped everything with crispy fried onions. It was not fancy, but it was expected, and its absence would have been noticed. The dish baked until the edges bubbled and the onions turned golden, and it was served with a spoon that scooped up all the layers at once. This was food that required almost no preparation, but delivered the kind of comfort people associated with home-cooked meals. It showed up at every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every gathering where the meal needed to feel complete. And there were other vegetables in different forms. Corn pudding was sweet and savory at the same time, made with corn kernels, eggs, milk, and butter, then baked until it set into something between a custard and a casserole. The top turned golden, the inside stayed soft, and the flavor was mild enough to pair with almost anything. It appeared on holiday tables, at church dinners, at any meal where someone wanted to offer something a little different without straying too far from tradition. The corn itself provided texture. The eggs held everything together, and the butter made it rich without being heavy. And it was not the only pudding. Bread pudding used leftover bread soaked in a custard made from eggs, milk, sugar, and spices, then baked until it puffed up and turned golden. It was served warm, sometimes with a drizzle of sauce made from butter and brown sugar, and it had a way of making people feel taken care of. This was food that came from not wasting anything, from understanding that even stale bread could be transformed into something worth eating. It appeared at gatherings where dessert mattered but did not need to be complicated, where the act of making something from almost nothing was part of the point. And then there were the cold dishes. Potato salad showed up at every outdoor gathering, every picnic, every after-church meal where people ate standing up or sitting on folding chairs. The potatoes were boiled until tender, then mixed with mayonnaise, mustard, boiled eggs, celery, and relish, and the result was something creamy and tangy that balanced out heavier dishes. It was made in large bowls, served with a slotted spoon, and people had strong opinions about whose version was best. The salad itself was filling without being overwhelming, and it provided a kind of coolness that cut through the richness of fried or baked foods. And it often sat beside something just as central. Ham, baked with glaze made from brown sugar, honey, and cloves, came out of the oven with a crust that glistened. The meat itself was tender, salty, sweet, and smoky all at once, and it was sliced thin and piled onto plates alongside everything else. This was holiday food, celebration food, food that marked special occasions, but also showed up at Sunday dinners when there was something to acknowledge. The ham fed a crowd, the leftovers made sandwiches and flavored beans, and nothing about it was wasted, yet people who ate it felt sustained in a way that lasted, and it was often the centerpiece. But there was one more dish. Turkey and dressing appeared at Thanksgiving and Christmas, but also at church homecomings and any gathering where the meal needed to feel significant. The turkey was roasted until the skin turned golden. The dressing made from cornbread and biscuits mixed with celery, onions, sage, and broth, then baked until it set. This was food that required planning, that brought people into the kitchen together, that could not be done alone. The turkey provided the protein, the dressing absorbed the drippings, and together they created a meal that felt complete. People ate it slowly, savoring the work that went into it, understanding that some dishes were about more than just eating. There was a quiet knowledge in those kitchens, not written down, but lived every day. Food was never just to fill the plate, it was to steady the body and the spirit. If this feels worth remembering, subscribe and stay connected to what still matters.